Sometimes the smallest fire in the coldest night can change the fate of an entire valley. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a living thing, dragging curtains of snow across the frozen ground and rattling the loose boards of a lonely ranch house that stood nearly a mile from the nearest road. Inside that weathered cabin, Elias Whitmore sat beside a small iron stove, the orange glow of the fire flickering across his lined face. At 68 years old, Elias had lived long enough to know the sound of every season, every storm, every lonely mile of land that surrounded his ranch. And tonight, the land was angry. Snow hammered the windows. The temperature had dropped close to 10 degrees below zero. No traveler with good sense would be out in weather like this. Elias lifted a dented tin mug of coffee and stared into the flames, listening to the wind scrape across the roof like dry brush across stone. 12 years had passed since another human voice had spent the night inside this cabin. 12 years since the world beyond the valley had stopped mattering much to him. Out here, the cattle, the mountains, and the quiet were enough. Then the knock came, soft at first, barely louder than the wind. Elias froze, his mug halfway to his lips. For a moment, he wondered if the storm had thrown a loose branch against the door. But then it came again, 3 slow taps against the old wood. Not the knock of a confident traveler, not the pounding of someone demanding shelter. This was weaker, desperate. Elias set the mug down and rose slowly from his chair, his boots creaking against the worn floorboards. A man who had spent decades alone learns to move carefully when the unexpected arrives. He crossed the room and opened the door just a few inches. The wind burst inside instantly, carrying snow and bitter cold that bit at his face like ice. And there, half buried in the drift against the porch, lay a woman. Her dark hair was stiff with frost. Her clothing, worn thin from travel, clung to her like frozen canvas. For a moment Elias simply stared. Even in the dim lantern light, he could see the small details that told their own story. The beadwork along the edge of her sleeve, the leather cord around her neck, the quiet strength in the lines of her face even as exhaustion pulled her down into the snow. Apache, the old rancher, stood there while the storm roared behind him and the fire cracked quietly at his back. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he opened the door wider, stepped forward, and lifted the woman carefully from the drift. She weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of winter blankets left out in the cold too long. Elias carried her inside and closed the door against the storm. The firelight warmed the room again. He set her gently beside the stove, wrapped one of his heavy wool blankets around her shoulders, and stirred the coals until the flames grew brighter. The woman's eyes opened slightly, dark and sharp even through the frost. She looked at the old rancher as if trying to understand why she was still alive. Elias didn't ask questions. Not yet. He simply handed her the tin mug of coffee and said in a calm, quiet voice that carried the weight of many silent winters, "Drink slow. The cold hasn't finished with you yet." Outside, the storm kept building over the valley. And far beyond the hills, riders were already moving through the night. The woman held the warm mug in both hands, the steam rising slowly into the lantern light while the storm continued to press against the cabin walls like a restless animal that refused to move on. Elias Whitmore watched her carefully from across the small room, not with suspicion exactly, but with the quiet caution of a man who had lived long enough to understand that every stranger carried a story, and sometimes those stories arrived on horseback. The woman drank slowly, just as he had told her, small careful sips that brought color back to her cheeks little by little. The frost along her hair began to melt, thin droplets sliding down the strands and falling onto the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The fire crackled softly between them, filling the silence with the steady rhythm of burning pine. After a long moment she spoke, her voice low but steady despite the cold that still clung to her bones. She said that her name was Nayeli. The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Elias nodded once, but did not ask anything else. Questions had a way of opening doors that a man might prefer to leave closed. Outside, the wind shifted directions, sending a sharp whistle through the narrow spaces between the cabin boards. Nayeli turned her head slightly toward the sound, listening with a focus that made Elias notice something new about her. Even tired and half frozen from the storm, there was strength in the way she moved, the kind that came from long miles of travel and a life spent reading the land. She asked quietly how far the nearest town might be. Elias answered that the town of Red Hollow sat about 12 miles east if the weather behaved itself, though tonight it clearly had other plans. The woman nodded slowly as if measuring distance in her mind, the way riders did when the path ahead mattered more than the comfort behind them. Elias rose from his chair and walked to a wooden shelf where a cast iron pot rested beside a small sack of dried beans. He scooped a portion into the pot and placed it near the stove where the heat could wake the flavor back to life. The smell of cooking soon joined the scent of burning pine, filling the little cabin with a warmth that pushed the storm a little farther away. Nayeli watched him work in silence. When the bowl was ready, he handed it to her without ceremony, just the simple gesture of one human being offering another the chance to stand on steady feet again. She thanked him quietly and began to eat. The quiet returned after that, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The kind that came when two strangers shared the same fire and the same storm without needing many words between them. Outside, the wind finally began to slow, though the snow continued drifting across the valley floor in long silver lines beneath the moon. Elias stepped to the small window beside the door and looked out across the frozen pasture where his fence posts stood half buried beneath white drifts. For a moment, everything seemed still, peaceful even. Then he noticed something far out along the dark edge of the valley. A faint movement. At first it looked like nothing more than the shifting shadow of clouds passing across the snow. But Elias had spent too many winters watching this land to mistake what he was seeing. The shadows were moving together, and they were moving fast. The shadows on the far edge of the valley did not disappear. They grew clearer. Elias Whitmore stood still at the window, his weathered hand resting against the wooden frame while his eyes followed the faint movement across the snow. A lifetime on this land had taught him to read distance the way other men read newspapers. 1,200 yards out, maybe a little farther. Whatever it was, it moved in a long, thin line along the ridge where the moonlight touched the frozen ground. Behind him, the small cabin remained warm and quiet. The fire snapped gently inside the iron stove. Nayeli finished the last of the beans and lowered the bowl slowly, her attention drifting toward the window as well. She could feel the change in the air. Riders knew when the world outside had shifted. Elias did not turn around when he spoke. He simply said that there were travelers moving across the valley. His voice carried no alarm, only the calm observation of a man describing weather rolling in. Nayeli stood carefully, still wrapped in the thick wool blanket, and stepped closer to the window beside him. For several seconds, she studied the distant shapes cutting across the snow. The moon hung low behind them, turning the moving figures into dark silhouettes that rose and fell with the slow rhythm of horses traveling over uneven ground. Elias counted quietly under his breath the way old ranchers sometimes did when judging the size of a herd from miles away. One rider could be a traveler. Two riders could be neighbors helping each other through a storm. But when the count passed 5 and then 10, the meaning changed. Nayeli finally spoke in a calm voice that carried the weight of someone who already understood what the old rancher was seeing. She said that they were not lost travelers. Elias nodded slightly, still watching the distant ridge. The riders were spreading now, forming a wider line as they moved through the valley floor. The snow muffled the sound of hooves, but the shape of their movement told its own story. Organized, purposeful, a group that knew exactly where it was going. The old rancher stepped back from the window and reached for a small lantern hanging near the door. He turned the wick lower so the light would not carry too far into the night. Habits like that stayed with a man long after he stopped expecting visitors. Nayeli watched him for a moment before speaking again. She asked quietly if the valley often saw this many riders before sunrise. Elias shook his head once. The land around his ranch usually held only cattle, wind, and silence. A gathering like that meant one thing. Someone out there was searching for something important. Outside, the line of riders continued to move closer, the distance between them shrinking as they crossed the open stretch of frozen pasture that led toward the lonely cabin. The moon slid between clouds above them, revealing flashes of movement that confirmed what Elias had already begun to suspect. There were more riders behind the first line, many more. The valley that had been silent all winter was waking up with the quiet thunder of horses moving through the snow. Nayeli pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, though the warmth of the fire still filled the room. She looked once more at the growing shapes along the ridge, then turned toward the old rancher. Her eyes were steady now, no longer tired, no longer uncertain. She said softly that by the time the sun touched the hills, the entire valley would know exactly where she was. The cabin grew quiet again after her words settled into the air, but it was no longer the peaceful quiet that Elias Whitmore had known for years. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy between two people when the world outside has begun to move in ways that cannot be stopped. Elias turned slightly from the window and studied the woman beside the fire. The blanket around her shoulders had slipped enough for him to notice the small leather cord resting against her collarbone. Hanging from it was a piece of silver shaped like a small crescent, polished smooth from years of wear. It caught the firelight each time the flames shifted, sending brief flashes of pale light across the cabin walls. Elias had seen many things during his life on the frontier, and symbols like that one rarely belonged to someone ordinary. Nayeli followed his gaze for a moment, then gently lifted the pendant into her palm as if weighing whether it was time to explain. Outside, the riders continued to move closer across the valley. The distance that once stretched more than half a mile was shrinking now, their silhouettes clearer each time the moon slipped free from the drifting clouds. Elias walked back toward the stove and added another piece of pine to the fire. The new log caught quickly, sparks rising and twisting through the iron grate before settling into a steady flame. The warmth filled the room again, though the feeling in the cabin had changed. Nayeli spoke quietly as she watched the fire grow brighter. She said that the men riding across the valley were not searching for land or cattle or lost travelers. They were searching for her. Elias leaned one shoulder against the wooden table and folded his arms loosely, the posture of a man who had heard many strange stories and preferred to let them finish before deciding what to believe. Nayeli explained that she had been traveling through the lower hills when she discovered something that did not belong there. A group of riders from Red Hollow had been moving through Apache territory without permission, speaking openly about plans that could bring trouble to both sides of the valley. She had listened from the shadows and understood enough to know that word needed to reach her people before those plans grew into something larger. Elias listened without interrupting. The frontier was full of rumors and quiet tensions, but the calm certainty in her voice told him this was not the kind of story invented by fear. She said she had been riding hard for 2 days before the storm caught her along the ridge. Her horse had carried her as far as it could before the cold forced her to walk the last miles through snow that reached nearly to her knees. The only light she had seen in the dark valley was the lantern in his cabin window. Elias rubbed his chin slowly while he thought about the riders still approaching across the frozen pasture. From what he had seen through the glass, there were too many men out there for this to be a simple misunderstanding. Nayeli turned her eyes toward the door now, listening to the distant wind that carried faint echoes of movement across the land. She said softly that the riders from Red Hollow believed they were still following her trail through the hills. What they did not know was that the trail had ended here, at a lonely cabin where an old rancher had chosen kindness instead of questions. Elias looked once more toward the dark valley beyond the window. The riders were closer now, their shapes stretching across the snow like a long, moving shadow. He exhaled slowly and said in the steady voice of a man who had faced many storms that morning would arrive soon enough, and when it did, the valley would decide what kind of story this night was going to become. The wind eased as the night moved toward morning, leaving the valley wrapped in a cold quiet that felt deeper than the storm itself. Elias Whitmore stood beside the window with his hands resting on the wooden sill, watching the distant riders move slowly across the frozen land. The moonlight revealed them more clearly now. They were still far enough away that individual faces could not be seen, but the pattern of their movement spoke louder than any words. They were following a trail, and that trail led directly to the small ranch house sitting alone in the center of the valley. Behind him, the fire continued to burn steadily, its glow reflecting in the iron stove and casting warm light across the rough plank walls. Nayeli remained near the hearth, the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders while she studied the quiet determination in the old rancher's posture. Elias did not look like a man preparing for trouble. He looked like a man deciding how to greet the morning. After several long moments, he turned from the window and reached for his heavy coat hanging near the door. The leather creaked softly as he lifted it from the peg. He slipped it over his shoulders with the slow patience of someone who had performed the same motion thousands of times through long winters and early cattle drives. Nayeli watched him carefully and asked what he intended to do when the riders reached the ranch. Elias pulled on a pair of worn gloves and answered in the calm voice of a man who did not see the value in rushing decisions before sunrise. He said that men who ride through a storm in the middle of the night usually arrive with questions, and questions were easier to answer when everyone could see each other clearly in the morning light. Nayeli stepped closer to the window again, studying the distant shapes that were now crossing the lower pasture. She counted them quietly in her mind. 10 riders at the front, another group behind them, and still more shadows moving farther back along the ridge. The numbers told a story that even the silent snow could not hide. These were not men wandering the valley by accident. They had come with purpose, and they believed they were close to finding what they were looking for. The fire popped softly in the stove, sending a brief swirl of sparks upward through the grate. Elias opened a small wooden cabinet and removed another lantern, lighting the wick just enough to cast a faint glow across the cabin floor. He did not brighten the room. He only prepared for the moment when darkness would give way to morning. Nayeli noticed the careful way he moved, the steady rhythm of each small task. For a man who had lived alone for many years, he carried a surprising calm in the face of approaching riders. She asked him quietly why he had not told her to leave when he first saw the figures moving through the valley. Elias paused for a moment before answering. He looked toward the door, then toward the fire, as though measuring the weight of the question against the quiet life he had built in this place. Finally, he said that a person freezing in the snow deserved warmth more than suspicion, and once a fire was shared, it became harder to pretend the other person did not belong beneath that roof. Nayeli lowered her eyes for a moment, holding the silver pendant gently in her palm. Outside, the riders continued closing the distance across the frozen pasture. The sky along the eastern hills had begun to lighten just slightly, the first hint that sunrise was not far away. The valley that had slept through the storm was waking now. And with every slow step of those approaching horses, the quiet ranch in the middle of the snow was becoming the center of a story that neither of them could turn away from. The faint gray light of approaching morning slowly crept across the valley, turning the endless blanket of snow into a pale silver sea that stretched from the hills to the lonely ranch house standing in its center. Elias Whitmore pushed the cabin door open and stepped out onto the wooden porch, the cold air biting through his coat, but not enough to drive him back inside. The world had grown quiet in that strange way it sometimes did before sunrise, when even the wind seemed to pause and listen. From where he stood, The valley spread nearly a mile wide before rising toward the low ridges beyond his pasture. And across that open ground, the riders were no longer distant shadows. They were shapes now, clear shapes, horses moving in steady rhythm, breath rising from their nostrils in faint clouds that drifted through the cold air. Elias counted them again the way old cattlemen did when judging a herd from across a field. 10 riders in the front line, another cluster behind them, more still emerging from the pale horizon as the growing light revealed what the darkness had hidden. Nayeli stepped quietly onto the porch beside him, the wool blanket still around her shoulders, though the fire inside had already warmed her strength. She did not speak at first. Her eyes moved across the valley, following the same riders Elias had been watching for the past hour. The slow rhythm of their approach carried a different meaning to her. She could recognize the posture of men riding with purpose, and she could recognize the difference between pursuit and protection. Elias rested both hands on the porch railing and exhaled slowly, his breath drifting into the morning air. He had lived in this valley long enough to know that large gatherings of riders rarely arrived without changing something. Land changed hands. Alliances shifted. Sometimes peace arrived. Sometimes trouble followed behind it like a second shadow. The first line of riders reached the lower fence along his pasture and slowed their horses to a careful walk. The wooden posts stood half buried in snow, stretching across the valley like a quiet boundary between two worlds. One rider at the front lifted a hand, and the others behind him spread outward slightly, forming a wide arc that covered the open field. From the porch, Elias could see the worn coats and broad hats of men who had spent their lives riding under hard skies. They looked toward the cabin, toward the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, and toward the two figures standing together on the porch. Nayeli studied them carefully for a moment before speaking in a calm voice that carried no fear. She said these were not the riders she had expected to find first. Elias glanced toward her without turning his head fully. He asked quietly who they were. Nayeli answered that they were men from Red Hollow, the same riders who had been following her trail through the hills. The old rancher nodded once, absorbing the meaning behind her words. Down in the pasture, the front rider urged his horse forward, guiding it slowly across the snow toward the ranch house. The other men remained behind him, watching the porch with the steady attention of people who believed they were close to the end of a long search. The distance between horse and cabin closed yard by yard until the rider stopped about 30 feet from the porch steps. The sky behind him brightened another shade as the sun prepared to rise over the eastern hills. For a moment, no one spoke. The valley held its breath. Then the rider tipped his hat slightly and called out in a voice that carried easily across the cold air, asking the old rancher if he had seen a traveler pass through the valley during the night. Elias Whitmore rested his arms on the porch railing and looked down at the man without hurry. Behind him, the fire still burned warm inside the cabin, and far beyond the ridge to the west, more distant movement had begun to appear against the growing light. The rider waited patiently below the porch while the pale morning light continued spreading across the valley. His horse shifted its weight in the snow, breath rising in slow clouds that drifted through the cold air. Elias Whitmore studied the man for a long moment before answering. Years on the frontier had taught him that silence often revealed more than quick words. The rider looked like many men who passed through Red Hollow. Weathered coat, dust-worn hat, eyes that had spent a lifetime measuring distance and opportunity at the same time. But there was something else behind those eyes now. Expectation. Elias finally spoke in the calm voice of a rancher who had nothing to prove to strangers. He said that storms had a way of hiding travelers and revealing them again somewhere unexpected. The rider listened carefully to the answer, as if weighing every word the old man offered. Behind him, the other men remained spread across the pasture, watching the porch with quiet patience. None of them raised their voices. None of them hurried. They were men who believed the valley was already on their side. Beside Elias, Naeli stood still with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze moving across the riders one by one. She recognized several of them from the hills beyond Red Hollow. Men who spent more time chasing rumors than cattle. Men who believed that every trail eventually ended where they expected it to. The rider below the porch rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn and glanced toward the cabin door behind Elias. His voice carried a polite tone that did not quite reach his eyes. He said they had been following the tracks of a lone traveler for nearly 2 days through snow and broken hills. The trail had ended somewhere near this ranch. He asked if the old man would mind if they looked around a little, just to be certain they had not missed anything important. Elias leaned slightly against the porch railing, the wooden boards creaking quietly under his weight. He looked across the valley before answering, letting the growing sunlight reveal more of the riders waiting near the fence. Then he looked back at the man below him. The old rancher said that men were free to ride wherever the land allowed, but the snow on his pasture had already been walked enough for one night. The rider held his gaze for a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether the answer carried hidden meaning. Behind him, one of the other riders shifted his horse forward a few steps, curiosity beginning to replace patience. Naeli felt the tension building the same way a rider feels the wind change before a storm. But before the conversation could move any further, something else changed in the valley. Elias noticed it first, a faint tremor beneath the quiet morning air. Not close, not yet, but familiar. It was the distant rhythm of many horses moving together across frozen ground. The rider below the porch heard it a second later. His head turned slowly toward the western ridge where the hills curved downward into the valley. At first there was nothing to see but sunlight touching the snow. Then small shapes began to appear along the horizon. One rider, then another, then more. The line stretched wider with each passing second as the rising sun revealed a gathering that had not been there before. The men from Red Hollow watched the distant ridge in growing silence. And beside the old rancher on the porch, Naeli allowed herself the smallest breath of relief as the first riders of her own people began descending into the valley. The valley changed in a matter of seconds. What had begun as a faint tremor across the western ridge quickly became the unmistakable rhythm of many horses moving together over frozen ground. The riders from Red Hollow turned their heads toward the sound, their earlier confidence fading as the growing light revealed more figures descending from the hills. At first it looked like a small group crossing the ridgeline. Then the line stretched wider, and wider still. Elias Whitmore rested both hands on the porch railing and watched the horizon fill with movement the way a man watches a distant storm roll across open land. Naeli stood beside him, her eyes steady now, the silver pendant resting quietly against her chest. The riders coming down the ridge were not scattered travelers. They moved with purpose and balance, spreading across the slope in a long sweeping line that caught the rising sunlight. Their horses stepped through the snow with the calm rhythm of animals that knew the land beneath them. One rider appeared at the front, then another beside him, then 10 more behind them as the entire ridge slowly filled with silhouettes against the pale sky. The men from Red Hollow shifted uneasily in their saddles. The rider closest to the porch turned his horse slightly, trying to measure the distance between his group and the approaching line. What he saw made him pause. The valley that had seemed empty only moments ago now carried more riders than he had expected to face. Elias could see it clearly from where he stood. The approaching riders were not rushing. They were not shouting. They were simply arriving, filling the open valley with a quiet presence that grew larger with every passing second. Naeli stepped forward slightly and rested one hand on the porch post, watching the riders descend toward the frozen pasture. The morning sun rose slowly behind them, turning the snow beneath their horses into a field of pale gold. Elias counted again without meaning to. 20 riders along the front line, then 30, then more appearing behind them as the ridge continued to reveal its hidden shapes. The old rancher had spent his life reading the land, and he understood what the riders from Red Hollow were beginning to realize. They had not arrived first. Down in the pasture, the man who had spoken earlier straightened in his saddle and looked from the porch to the ridge and back again. The question he had come to ask no longer seemed as simple as it had an hour before. One of the men behind him murmured something low that Elias could not hear, but the meaning carried through the group all the same. Their search had led them into a gathering far larger than they expected. The riders from the ridge continued moving forward, their line spreading across the valley floor like a slow tide rolling toward shore. As they reached the lower fields, several horses stepped ahead of the others, forming a quiet lead that guided the rest down from the hills. Nayeli finally spoke, her voice calm and certain as she watched the riders approach. She said that her people had followed the storm through the night when word reached them that she had not returned. They had ridden through the dark hills until the valley opened before them. Elias glanced toward her, then back to the growing line of riders filling the pasture beyond his fence. The snow beneath the horses glowed brighter as the sun climbed over the eastern ridge. The valley that had begun the night in silence was now alive with movement from every direction. And for the first time since the storm had passed, the men from Red Hollow began to understand that the story unfolding in this frozen valley was no longer theirs to control. The valley held its breath as the riders continued descending from the western ridge. Morning sunlight spread slowly across the snow, revealing more horses, more riders, until the quiet pasture surrounding Elias Whitmore's ranch was filled with the steady presence of men who had ridden through the night. The men from Red Hollow remained where they were, their horses shifting uneasily as the growing line approached. Elias rested calmly against the porch railing, his weathered eyes studying the unfolding scene with the patience of a man who had seen the land change many times before. Nayeli stepped forward beside him, the silver pendant resting against her chest, her gaze fixed on the riders who were now crossing the final stretch of open ground. The lead riders slowed their horses as they reached the outer fence line, spreading out in a wide arc that gently surrounded the lower pasture without raising a single voice. It was not a show of force. It was something older than that, something quieter. Elias noticed the man riding at the front of the group. He carried himself with the calm authority of someone whose presence alone could guide the rest. His horse stepped forward a few yards ahead of the others before stopping in the snow about 40 feet from the porch. The man looked toward Nayeli first. His expression softened in a way that needed no explanation. Nayeli stepped down from the porch slowly, the blanket still around her shoulders, and walked a few steps into the yard where the morning light touched the snow. The man on the horse lowered his head slightly in greeting. No words were needed at first. The silence between them carried the relief of a long night ending. Behind him, the riders remained still, their horses breathing clouds into the cold air. The men from Red Hollow watched carefully from their position near the pasture fence. Their earlier questions had faded into quiet observation. The rider nearest the porch removed his hat and ran a hand slowly across the brim, realizing that whatever search had brought him here had already reached its end. Nayeli turned back toward the cabin and gestured gently toward Elias. The rider at the front followed her motion with his eyes, studying the old rancher who still leaned calmly against the porch railing. After a moment, he guided his horse a few steps forward and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried across the frozen yard. He said that they had followed the storm through the hills when they realized Nayeli had not returned. They had feared the worst until they found her trail leading down into this valley. Nayeli answered quietly that the storm had nearly taken her strength before she saw the light in the old rancher's window. Elias lifted one hand slightly in a small greeting, the gesture simple and unceremonious. The rider nodded once, understanding more from that single motion than a long explanation could provide. He said that kindness shown during a winter night was not forgotten among his people. Then he turned his horse slightly, and spoke a few calm words to the riders behind him. The line shifted gently, opening the valley once more. No one raised a voice. No one reached for anything except the reins guiding their horses. The men from Red Hollow looked at one another briefly before easing their horses back toward the road leading east. The valley that had filled with riders only minutes before began to breathe again as the groups slowly moved apart. Naeli returned to the porch and looked once more at the quiet ranch that had given her shelter. Elias simply nodded toward the open land beyond the pasture, as if to say that the valley would remember the night in its own way. The sun climbed higher above the hills, spreading warm light across the snow. And for the first time since the storm had passed, the land returned to its familiar silence, carrying with it the quiet truth that sometimes a single shared fire could change the path of an entire valley.